Welcome to the second half. Welcome to the closer look for the 1st of November 2023 on U.S. strategic posture and current threats. This is part one of a series. It could be a two, could be a three-part series. It's a bit unknown at this point. We will get through as much of the agenda as we can here in the time that we have left in today's briefing, and then we will just pick it up right where we left off next week until we get through this extensive material. Now, full disclosure, a lot of this material is from the IDA. This is the Institute for Defense Analysis. They're a private nonprofit corporation headquartered in Alexandria, Virginia. They typically focus on U.S. security and policy type questions. They manage three federally funded research and development centers. So joined at the hip to the federal government. However, they do typically do a very thorough job in their reporting, and they do a very good job of keeping partisanship and bias out of their reports. And so for not for all of the material that we are about to review in a closer look, but a decent part of it is from this particular report on America's strategic posture. If you wanted to look that up, it's about 160 pages long, a lot of good stuff in there to read as you're trying to fall asleep. So this is the executive summary directly out of the document. It says the United States faces a strategic challenge requiring urgent action. Given current threat trajectories, our nation will soon encounter a fundamentally different global setting than it has ever experienced. We will face a world where two nations possess nuclear arsenals on par with our own. In addition, the risk of conflict with these two nuclear peers is increasing. It is an existential challenge for which the United States is ill prepared, unless its leaders make decisions now to adjust the U.S. strategic posture. So, current strategic threats, and we're going to go overview of the current strategic threats. And then after that, we're going to go nation by nation, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran to break that down on a more granular level. So essentially, you have these two nuclear peer adversaries, China and Russia. These nuclear peers are both highly, highly capable. China in particular is innovating at an extremely rapid rate when it comes to its not only its ICBM technology, but also its nuclear technology. There is a growing, ever growing threat as well of both kinetic and non-kinetic cyber attacks. Kinetic being a cyber attack that directly affects infrastructure, for example. Non-kinetic would be the MOVEit hack, for example, that we covered just moments ago in the hotspot briefing, where it's espionage, it's gathering sensitive materials, that type of thing. Russia is second in the world in its cyber capabilities behind the United States. China would be a third, but both are extremely capable. And one of the things that's a changing dynamic is this growing partnership between China and Russia. If you go back years, China and Russia have actually had border skirmishes and such. If you go back a few decades, they have always viewed each other with great suspicion. During China's rise, China coming up kind of as Russia was declining after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia views China as a surging power that they are now in the position of having to take a secondary role behind. So for years, the China-Russia relationship was such that Russia took the lead in everything, right? They led the military drills. They would take the lead when negotiating trade deals. They would take the lead on really everything. It's swapped. It's no longer Russia taking a lead. When you see joint Russia-China military drills, China's in charge. When you see trade deals being proposed, China's the one that now has the leverage to negotiate more than Russia does. So the partnership is there with China in a leading role. Now, the U.S. National Defense Strategy currently, if you read the most recent version, or at least the unclassified version that was released, it does not really address this partnership in any real terms. It focuses on how to win a peer level conflict, but it does not address at any part throughout that document, does not address two. It does not address how to simultaneously fight a war in the Indo-Pacific region and Asia, and then also on a European front. It's simply ignored as if it can't happen. However, should the circumstances in Ukraine, for example, or in the Middle East devolve to a point where you're looking at a legitimate World War III, which is not likely, but it is possible, the U.S. could find itself in the position of needing to fight both adversaries. And right now, there's simply there's no plan to fight both of these nations at the same time. So moving on from there, China, we briefly touched on their rapidly building up nuclear capacities. In the 20th of October hotspot report, we covered a Pentagon's report, the China Military Power Report, that said China has 500 nuclear weapons, with 100 added in the last year. So China rapidly adding to its nuclear arsenal. Now, this number, this 500 number, is almost certainly low. If you do the math, just on China's ICBM silos, if you do the math on their submarine, their nuclear submarine forces, and you just start adding it up, if their silos actually have nuclear weapons in them, and if their submarines carry the full contingent of nuclear weapons, you're over 500. And that doesn't even count any that might be held in storage or held in reserve, etc. So I was talking to Colonel John Mills about this on Monday, and his assessment was essentially that China is almost certainly holding at least 1,000 nuclear missiles. Now, obviously can't fully verify that, but 500 appears to be very low. So as we think about the strategic threats in the world, China rapidly adding to its arsenal is at the top of the list. And on Russia's side as well, massive stockpiles, as I'm sure you're well aware, but they've also been working on a multi-year nuclear modernization program that has led to some really significant improvements. They have worked on their ICBM technology. The Sarmat nuclear weapon is now being rolled out. It's extremely large. Sarmat is Satan in Russia. And so they've rolled out the Sarmat. They've rolled out greatly improved cruise missiles, capable enough to fire from Russia over the North Pole through Canada and strike the mainland United States. This is why we covered in the hotspot report a few days back that this is why the U.S. is about to put 4 additional radars pointed to the north, specifically geared and specifically designed to detect low-flying cruise missiles, and Canada's adding 2. Those are supposed to begin construction next year, because their improvements during this multi-year modernization program stretched even beyond nuclear. Russia does have the ability to fit nuclear weapons on cruise missiles, and as it stands right now, the United States would not likely detect a low-flying barrage of cruise missiles out of Russia. So Russia continuing to pursue improvements there and being quite successful in it. Russia also is continuing to work on both biological and chemical weapons. This is a pretty significant area of focus for Russia. They are not a signer on most of the treaties that the developed world has signed on to regarding the development of these types of weapons. So Russia, known to be pursuing both biological and chemical weapons dominance. A couple of notes on North Korea as well. Continuing to expand and diversify its nuclear forces. The report noted that North Korea could challenge U.S. missile defenses in the near future because they're building up their ICBMs to the extent that they should be able to fire large barrages at a time. Some of them would likely be duds as well. North Korea's doctrine it kind of focuses on launch everything you've got or almost everything you've got simultaneously, even if you can't put a nuclear warhead on each one. So North Korea getting close to the point where such a barrage would not be fully shot down by American air defenses. So significant challenge coming there. Iran doesn't have the capability of striking the United States with ICBMs at this point, but they are making some pretty significant strides in their ICBM technology. And according to the report anyway, at some point in the 2027 to 2035 timeframe is most likely when Iran would be able to field at least nuclear capable ICBMs, capable of carrying such a payload, right? Even if they don't actually have nuclear weapons at that time. So very interesting quote here from the report that says this: China, Russia, or both simultaneously may believe that the United States and its allies are unlikely to oppose their regional aggression with sufficient forces to guarantee victory, since doing so may leave the United States and its allies vulnerable in another theater. A very valid point. These states may gamble that their perceived greater stake in a conflict's outcome, combined with perceived U.S. limitations, may offer a unique opportunity for their successful aggression. The speed and scale of success of U.S. forces in meeting that aggression in one theater may greatly influence the chances of conflict or success in conflict in the other theater. And this is a very, I love this, that this is in the report, because this is exactly what we have discussed in our two global SITREP videos that we've done for Closer Looks. One was in December last year, and then in February, we updated our analysis a bit and released another video. The updated analysis, by the way, was increasing the odds of a conflict between Israel and Iran, or Israel and Iranian linked proxies. That happened. Iran and Israel going to war or significant war with Iranian proxies in Israel was our #1 area to watch in both of those SITREP videos. But if you go back to those videos, one of the things that we talked about is that the U.S. has very little ability to fight a two-front war. We've covered U.S. defense infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific in another Closer Look, where we released the same analysis there as well. But beyond fighting a two-front war, Russia and China are strategic enough in their thinking to understand that whichever conflict the U.S. is drawn into first is likely to receive the majority of U.S. Military assets and attention and focus. So, for example, should we, for whatever set of circumstances, right, enter into a war with Russia, we're going to surge troops to Europe. We're going to send significant naval and air assets as well. We're going to be heavily, heavily focused on that front. Well, if China then, a couple of months in, moves on Taiwan, it's the U.S. simply does not have the defense infrastructure, the weaponry, or the troops at this time to then do the same and surge towards Taiwan, particularly because it would likely leave the U.S. homeland extremely vulnerable. It would also leave us unable to appropriately live up to our treaties to defend other nations, right? The difficulty here for China and Russia is who goes first. If that's a scenario that they believe is valid, and it's likely a scenario that is accurate and that leadership in Russia and China do believe is valid. So who goes first? Because that's where the U.S. assets are going to go. There's another option that I think is valid, and this is not covered in this particular report, is that the U.S. is sending so many resources to Ukraine and now to Israel as well, that as those conflicts play out, the U.S. is drawing down a lot of its warfighting munitions, expendable munitions, right? We've talked about 155 millimeter artillery shells a lot. And as that happens, as you see the U.S. and the West as well kind of draw down its assets, That is puts China in particular into a more favorable position when it comes to a potential invasion of Taiwan. So something to keep an eye on for sure. One of the reasons that we believe that the window of time is most open for China to move against Taiwan is late 2023 through 2025. We released that analysis almost 2 years ago now, is because the United States is ramping up its production of essentially all munitions at this time. Taiwan, Japan, Australia, et cetera, are arming up heavily. Much of Europe, especially Poland, is arming up very heavily as well, at a rate we haven't seen in decades. And so should China and or Russia, according to this assessment, continue to delay any serious action into the late 2020s, for example, the other side is going to be in a much greater position to resist. So moving on from that topic, because that we could talk about just that scenario for a couple of closer looks. Let's look specifically at the threat from China. The threat from China is the most significant threat that the United States faces on every level, right? Espionage on a strategic level, on a nuclear level, even with their growing capabilities and innovation. China intends to be the world's preeminent power by 2049. That is the 100th anniversary of the PRC. Dates like that, anniversaries like that, are hugely, hugely important in Chinese culture and in most Asian cultures as well. So 2049 it's circled in red, it's highlighted, it's got a star next to it in the PRC's calendar, right? 2049 is the time frame for China. They want to be clearly, unquestioningly the world's preeminent power by that day. And really everything that they're doing is focusing on supplanting the United States on that time frame. They do have a very heavy emphasis on deterrence within their military doctrine. So while China is continuing to build its capacities really everywhere when it comes to its military, their doctrine is actually fairly tame when it comes to offense. They do not authorize first strikes under almost any scenario, especially nuclear first strikes. Their plan right now, as it stands, is to be able to deliver beyond devastating counterstrikes, right? So no real restrictions on their military programs when it comes to development. You know, the U.S. restricts itself when it comes to military research in a wide variety of ways. China has no such restrictions. They will test things on chemical warfare, for example. They'll test on animals. They'll occasionally test them on prisoners or Uyghur Muslims as well. They have no limitations when it comes to developing biological weapons. They have no limitations on their nuclear program whatsoever. You get the idea, right? So one of the threats from China is that they can build up capacity very quickly because they are not restricting themselves like the Western world is. Specifically in the nuclear realm, their nuclear force expansion has been at a breakneck speed over the past few years. The Pentagon report says over 1,000 warheads by 2030. We've already discussed that. They are innovating in both air and sea and ground-based platforms. They are tweaking high yield and low yield and variable yield weapons. They are working on hypersonic glide vehicles. They have flown a single hypersonic glide vehicle about 40,000 kilometers at one point in time. So serious innovation here. As you can see from the map there on the right-hand side, all of the United States is pretty easily in range of their longer ICBMs, and this isn't counting hypersonics. 40,000 kilometers, pretty significant range when you consider how large the globe is. So China continuing to innovate very rapidly in this space. Now, you've also got space and counter space threats from China. 2045, so just ahead of that 2049 date, China believes that it will surpass or match the United States in space. Right now, it's kind of the US and then China. They've got about 500 satellites in orbit. As of the last reliable estimates from 2021, we do know that they have continued to add since, so probably somewhere around 550 or 600 at this point in time. And one of the things about China's space program, we've done another closer look on this a few months back, actually, um, is that they have a heavy focus in dual use satellites, and they have a heavy focus in releasing objects from satellites that are maneuverable. So China has launched military satellites on multiple occasions that are kind of your typical surveillance satellite, but then after it's in orbit, the US military has detected elements of the satellites detaching and then moving off on their own power into another trajectory. So modular type satellites, but also with maneuverable components. And part of the reason that this is something that's so concerning is because it gives China the ability to take out other satellites, right? To harass, stalk, and otherwise disable American satellites, for example. And this is something where China leads the way. China leads the way in counter space operations. Right now, there are multiple satellites of China's that are continuing to stalk and track US military satellites. They'll maneuver into position close to an American satellite, and they'll essentially just co-orbit with it as it goes along. The US military at this time typically just moves their satellite to a new trajectory, and then China does the same. So counter space operations could be extraordinarily critical in a conflict between the US and China. And right now, this is one of the areas where China has a fairly notable lead in their ability. The US, by the way, with China approaching 600 satellites, the US has about 3,000 satellites. Just to give you a point of reference there. But again, when we're talking about satellites and space and counter space, pure numbers is not really that important. It's the tech and the capabilities that is the most important thing. And China continues to put satellites in orbit specifically that are designed to take out ours. Now, moving to the cyber realm, broadest, most active, and persistent cyber espionage threat was how the report put it. China certainly heavily involved in espionage against the United States via cyber. I think we're all well aware of that. But also, this report assessed that China is fully capable of disrupting infrastructure within the United States. And the evidence that this is true is pretty easy to find, right? You can find testimony by American officials stating that they've found bits of Chinese code in infrastructure systems. You can find all types of evidence that China is heavily invested in penetrating our infrastructure for nefarious purposes. Not that they do anything at the time, but they're probing. They want to probe. They want to have the ability to disrupt infrastructure should a conflict break out. So this is another big part of China's overall deterrence strategy here. Electronic warfare is another area that was focused on here. It's an integral component of warfare per the PLA's doctrine, mostly focused on jammers of various types, right? They do have space-based jammers on satellites. There's not much known about them though. Ground and air is pretty straightforward, right? There's typical systems of average technological value, and et cetera. But the space-based ones, we do know that they have been tested. They have been tested around Taiwan, actually. If you look at some of the jamming activities that have taken place there. So we do know that they have some level of capacity, but what's not known is to what extent, could China operate satellite-based jammers across multiple states or half the country? Those that know aren't talking. But this is something that China has been working on pretty heavily over the last decade or so. Lastly, for China, um, chemical and biological weapons. The United States does not have sufficient information to determine whether China has eliminated its assessed programs, is how the report put it. In other words, ongoing. China doesn't really comment on this. They'll issue very generic comments about these programs are not ongoing at this time, but they also have dozens and dozens of biolabs, such as the one COVID came from, et cetera, all across the country. So it's most likely that China is continuing to develop its chemical and its biological weapons system. So I'm going to pause there because the next slide is getting into the threat from Russia. And then after that, we have North Korea and Iran. We have the threat from emerging technology and other things like that we're going to cover. We have societal threats that we're going to cover as well as a part of this series. And then, of course, we finally get to the United States' own strategic posture and really the necessary changes that have to be made to face these threats in the future. So we'll pause there and we will pick up this next time. I don't see any questions that have come through in the chat, but as always, reach out to us, info@knightsbridge.ltd, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks for being with us today. Take care, and we will see you next week.